Is there really a secret that has been tightly locked behind the glitter of the K-pop stage? And is it possible that Jungkook's shocking confession in front of Jimmy Fallon will change everything forever? Check out this world-shaking emotional reveal right now in an in-depth investigation that has never been revealed before. Before we dive into this heart-wrenching truth, make sure you give it a thumbs up, share your thoughts in the comments about how you're feeling, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss every detail of this exclusive investigation. Have you ever imagined that behind the brightest smile in the world music industry lies a secret so suffocating that it must be hidden for years from the eyes of the public hungry for information? What would happen if a bond considered by millions to be pure brotherhood turned out to hold a much deeper layer of emotion, but instead had to be muted by the great power behind the scenes? That night, under the lights of the Tonight Show studio, which is usually filled with laughter and lighthearted jokes, the atmosphere suddenly turned tense when a global star of BTS's Jungkook class decided to pull the curtain that had been covering the dark side of his fame. Audiences packed the New York studio as if holding their breath, sensing something big was about to explode, a recognition that might shake the foundations of South Korea's entertainment industry and the world as a whole. Jimmy Fallon, the host known for his overflowing energy, seemed stunned and lost for words for a moment as a sentence slid slowly but sharply from the idol's lips, revealing that his relationship with Jimin, his closest groupmate, was once strictly forbidden by the authorities who controlled their careers. The surprise stemmed from a seemingly mundane question about the process of coming of age and how BTS members support each other amid inhumane global pressure. However, instead of giving a polished, diplomatic answer by the PR team, Jungkook lowered his head, nervously wagging his fingers, a rarely seen gesture from the man known as the confident Golden Magne. There was an unusual tremor in his voice, a tone of raw, painful honesty that hinted that he was no longer up to the burden of lies or half-truths. He began to tell about the early days of debuts, where every movement, every gaze, and even every interaction in front of the camera was closely monitored by management who had a specific vision of how their image should be formed in the eyes of the world. Amid a narrative of resounding success, Jungkook slips a hidden clue about a dark period he calls a period of emotional exile, a time in which his closeness to Jimin began to be perceived as a threat to the stability of the group and the trademark they were building. Audiences at home and in the studio may wonder, why would a relationship that seemed so positive and inspired millions through the concept of bromance actually be something that should be banned? The answer to this rhetorical question lies in the complexity of an idol industry that often prioritizes absolute control over the personal narratives of its artists. Jungkook revealed that there was a point where management felt that the closeness between himself and Jimin went beyond what was considered safe for public consumption. This recognition is not only surprising for its content, but also for Jungkook's courage to say it on a stage as big as The Tonight Show, a platform that has unlimited global reach. Jimmy Fallon, who is usually always ready with witty comments, could only lean his back against a chair with a facial expression that reflected a deep sense of disbelief, as if he had just been given the key to open the Pandora's box that had been buried under the success of Billboard's chart-topping albums. The tension in the air grew even more heated as Jungkook began detailing the specific moments in which their interactions were restricted. He talks about secret backstage instructions, about how they're asked not to stand side by side in certain interviews, and how sincere moments caught on camera often end up on the floor of the editing room, so as not to cause further speculation. The emotional twist in her story feels so real when she describes the loneliness she feels when the people she trusts most and is closest to are taken away from her in the name of professionalism and corporate image. This is not simply a story about the rules of a contract, but rather about the inner conflict of a young man who must choose between his big dream as a singer and his basic need to connect emotionally with other human beings. The world has always seen them as two inseparable stars, but in reality, there's a thick glass wall built between them by invisible hands, as Jungkook's narrative flows, it becomes increasingly clear that this confession is not just an attempt at attention-seeking or clickbait per se, but rather a release of a burden he has kept for more than a decade. He told how every time they tried to rebel against the ban, they would be faced with severe consequences, ranging from harsh reprimands to threats to their position within a group. Jimin, described by Jungkook as gentle but strong, was often the one who had to swallow his own bitterness in order to protect Jungkook, who is still very young and vulnerable to the pressures of the industry. The silence that enveloped the studio at that time seemed to make room for every word Jungkook said to sink into the hearts of everyone who listened to him, taking them into a whirlpool of emotions mixed between sympathy, anger, and admiration for his honesty. The secret that has been only a whisper among hardline fans has now exploded into an indisputable fact. Jungkook does not hesitate to use the word forbidden to describe the dynamics that take place behind the scenes, a word that has a very heavy weight in a Korean culture that still strongly upholds conservative norms and adherence to corporate hierarchy. He explained that the ban was not just about the physical, but also about the restriction of emotional wiggle room, where they were not allowed to show too deep dependence on each other because it was feared that it would damage the overall dynamics of the group. However, what the management did not realize at the time was that the more they were banned, the stronger the ties grew underground, in hidden places inaccessible to surveillance cameras or manager instructions. Jimmy Fallon finally managed to find his voice again, asking in a trembling tone about how Jimin felt when he found out that Jungkook was going to reveal all this now. Jungkook took a deep breath, his teary eyes reflecting the studio's light, and gave an answer that contained deep clues as to what would happen next in their careers and personal lives. He said that this decision to speak out was not just his own decision, but rather a tacit agreement they had reached after years of living in the shadow of fear. It is a declaration of independence, a way to take back the narrative of their lives that had been usurped by business interests. Viewers began to realize that what they saw that night was not just an ordinary celebrity interview, but a historic event that would redefine what it means to be an idol in the modern era. Furthermore, Jungkook described the atmosphere in their old dormitory, a place where outside pressure often made the atmosphere tense. There, in the narrow space they shared together, the prohibitions felt like invisible bars of iron. He told of late-night conversations conducted in a whispered voice so as not to be heard by the staff who lived with them, of how they reinforced each other when one of them felt like giving in to unreasonable demands. The deepest shock came when Jungkook revealed that there was a major incident that almost got one of them kicked out of the group, just because they were seen spending time together outside of the official schedule. These details provide a stark contrast to the images of freedom and happiness that are always featured in their social media content, creating a cognitive dissonance that leaves anyone who hears it shaken. This confession also touches on the deep psychological aspects of how the trauma of the ban shaped their current personalities. Jungkook admitted that he often felt overly anxious whenever he had to perform with Jimin, always wondering if he had made a mistake or if he was showing too much affection that could lead to new problems. This insecurity haunted him for many years, even when BTS had reached the peak of world popularity. He felt as if he lived in two different worlds, a world where he was revered as the god of music, and a world where he felt like a criminal just for wanting to stay close to his best friend and closest struggle partner. This painful contradiction is conveyed so eloquently by Jungkook, making everyone present reflect back on the price to pay for a success that looks perfect from the outside. Not stopping there, Jungkook also touched on how the company's policies are actually a reflection of a greater fear in society about any form of relationship that does not conform to conventional standards. She realized that by revealing this, she was not only challenging her management, but also challenging the expectations of millions of people who may not be ready to accept the more complex reality behind the idols' relationships. However, for him, honesty is the only way to heal old wounds that have been left gaping for too long. He wants fans to know that what they've seen so far is not a lie, but a filtered version of it, and that it's time for them to see the full picture, no matter how hard it may be to accept. The studio atmosphere grew even more emotional when Jungkook began to tell about the letters they had written to each other during the period of being banned from communicating freely. The letters became the only link for them, a safe space where they could pour out feelings that should not be spoken out loud. He mentions a few sentences from the letters that show how strong their desire is to remain united even though the world seems to be conspiring to separate them. This emotional touch brought many spectators to tears, realizing that behind a luxury of stadium concerts and private jets, there are two human souls who simply yearn for the freedom to love each other without fear of judgment or punishment. Jimmy Fallon, now visibly moved, tried to dig deeper into who exactly the people who issued the ban were. However, Jungkook wisely chose not to name specifics, instead referring to a system that has long been entrenched in the industry. He explained that this is not about one or two malicious individuals, but rather about a corporate culture that sees artists as assets that must be micro-controlled in order to minimize business risk. This explanation provides a new, broader perspective on the challenges faced by K-pop artists, who are often perceived as products rather than people by the companies that house them. Jungkook's admission was a sharp criticism of the industry that had raised him, an act that required extraordinary courage considering he was still under the same contract. The climax of this first chapter is reached when Jungkook recounts a moment where he and Jimin decided to no longer follow the rules blindly. He describes a secret meeting on the roof of the company building under the cold Seoul sky, where they promise each other that no matter what happens, they will always support each other and will not allow anyone's prohibitions to destroy the bond they have built since adolescence. It's that promise that Jungkook says has been the source of his strength over the years, allowing him to survive amid tremendous pressure and remain himself on stage. Jungkook's words of deep conviction and brotherly love close the opening segment of the interview with a vibe that will continue to resonate for a long time. Throughout this long and interminable narrative, we see Jungkook's transformation from an obedient idol into a grown man who dares to voice his own truth. Not a single part of the story feels monotonous, as each sentence that slides and brings new information that further deepens our understanding of the harsh reality behind the world's music industry. Every surprise he delivers isn't just to make people gasp, but rather to build a powerful argument for the need for a change in the way the industry treats its artists as whole people. This metaphor about forbidden relationships is no longer just a figure of speech, but a painful historical fact in the course of the careers of two of the world's biggest stars. Jimmy Fallon then asked Jungkook to explain how the relationship could eventually become a little more open as time went on. But Jungkook hinted that it was a long story that involved a lot of tears, grueling negotiations, and major changes in the power structure within their company. He gives hints that there are certain figures who are finally starting to listen to their voices, although it does not happen overnight. Other deeper secrets about how they navigate life under close scrutiny after the ban began to loosen became something everyone was eagerly awaiting. As the first segment ended, the camera zoomed in on Jungkook's, now slightly more relieved face, as if a heavy weight had just been lifted off his shoulders. However, for the audience, this is only the beginning of a long journey to understand the real truth. New questions began to arise. How did Jimin personally react to this confession? What steps will be taken by the management after this interview is broadcast globally? And most importantly, how will this reveal change the way the world sees BTS as a cultural phenomenon? The tension does not diminish. It only increases, as each answer given by Jungkook seems to open the door to new unsolved mysteries. The world is now waiting with bated breath, waiting for what the star will reveal next. This story about a once-forbidden relationship is not just about Jungkook and Jimin, but rather a mirror for many people who also feel trapped in unfair rules in their lives. With his courage, Jungkook has lit a fire of discussion that will not be easily extinguished, and every word he uttered before Jimmy Fallon that night will go down as one of the most frank and courageous moments in the history of modern popular culture. Its increasingly tense plot leads us to the understanding that the truth, however long hidden, will always find its way to be revealed, especially when it is driven by the power of sincere emotions and the desire to be free from the shackles of a painful past.